Hi everyone, welcome to the 2020 SCAT Virtual Symposium. My name is Michelle Futrell and I'm really looking forward to spending some time with you today talking about how you might maximize the education part of continuing education, or as I like to call this presentation, are we doing continuing education all wrong? You know, if you know much about public speaking, you know that one key to engaging your audience is to have some kind of a hook. That first 30 seconds is critical. It's when your listeners form an impression of what's to follow and you as a speaker. At most professional conferences, presenters start with pleasantries and the dreaded but required learning outcomes. I'm here to tell you that brain research shows that we don't pay attention to boring things. Since our talk is about continuing education, I'm going to do my best to A, not be boring, and B, give you the opportunity to learn a few things that perhaps you have never heard before. So in the interest of full disclosure, I've always been a learner. It's one of my top 5 strengths. School was my favorite game to play growing up. I was an excellent student. I graduated 3rd in my high school class, still a little bitter about that. Undergrad summa cum laude, and I don't really remember graduate school because, let's face it, I was an athletic training GA, so it was kind of a blur. But I just like to learn, and learning about how people learn is even cooler. But I have a confession to make. I was a great student, but I did it all wrong. And I'm willing to bet that many of you probably did too. So I hope that today you will be willing to examine your personal approach to learning and continuing education. You'll be willing to play along as we learn by doing, yes, even in a virtual environment. And you'll be willing to apply what you've learned with colleagues, students, your patients, and maybe even your children. So to begin, let's try to define learning. Here are some possible definitions. Acquiring knowledge and skills and having them readily available from memory so that you can make sense of future problems and opportunities. The process by which neural networks in the brain are developed by establishing connections between neurons. Those knowledge, skills, behaviors, and attitudes that you possess are represented by actual physical neural networks. That learning is able to be accessed later literally changes the brain, not merely uses it, but changes the brain. Learning is stabilized through repeated use. Certain appropriate and desirable synapses in the brain are strengthened as we use that. And my personal favorite, learning is hard work. But the flip side of that is that learning that requires effort creates the strongest neural pathways and the most learning. Think about maybe practicing learning to write with your non-dominant hand. That would be really challenging, but by the end of it, that skill would be very easy for you and encoded because you worked so hard to achieve it. Which brings me back to my original question. Are we doing continuing education all wrong? The purpose of continuing education is that clinicians can expand their expertise. But do clinicians most often look for the simplest, easiest ways to complete CEU activities in the shortest amount of time? We would be well served to keep in mind the wisdom of Doyle, who says, the one who does the work does the learning. So it's often helpful to prepare your brain to learn if you go into a learning session knowing what you hope to take away. In addition, the stronger your initial connection with the material, the more likely you are to remember it, especially if you can associate it with pictures, activities, or past experiences. So here's your first opportunity to play along. After I give the directions, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and follow the QR code, so scan it with your phone, or go to the URL on the screen to a Padlet where you can share your thoughts anonymously with other participants in this virtual webinar. While you're there, it would not hurt for you to take a minute to read and respond to a few of the comments that others have added. So, before you jet off, let's think back to your past continuing education experiences. I would venture to guess that you can remember some that were very good, some that were very bad, and a whole bunch in the middle that you don't remember at all. I would also be willing to bet that there are very few for which you still remember and apply information you learned in that session. So I ask again, are we doing continuing education all wrong? So now it's your turn. When you get to the Padlet, I want you to respond to these two prompts. What is one thing you hope to learn from this session? And in 3 to 5 words, describe the best continuing education experience you've ever attended. And best here equals learned the most information that actually stuck with you. Welcome back. I can't wait to read what you wrote in the Padlet. So now let's talk about the learning process. Let's talk for just a second about the science of how learning happens. So the first step in the learning process is called encoding. Encoding is the process through which information is brought into the brain through one or more of your senses to create a memory trace. This initial neural connection is housed in your short-term memory, but it is what the brain will use to create a more permanent memory. The more elaborate the encoding process, the stronger the initial connection will be. So the more detailed, the more multifaceted, the more emotionally you are connected to that memory, the better chance of recalling it later. Also, the more undistracted mental energy that's devoted to focusing on the new information, and the more challenging it is, the more likely it will be accurately and completely stored in your short-term memory. Step 2 is consolidation. Consolidation is when the brain takes that memory trace that you created and transfers it from the hippocampus, which is the fast learning but low capacity short-term memory storage unit, to the appropriate area of the neocortex, which is the slower learning, higher capacity, longer term memory storage. Under the right conditions, the memory trace is processed, it's replayed, rehearsed, given meaning, it fills in the blanks, connections are made to past experiences or already existing knowledge. This is why people who have significant amounts of prior knowledge in a specific subject area find new learning to be easier in that area. There's more places for your brain to make those connections. Now I need to return to something I said a moment ago. Under the right conditions, that memory trace is processed. Sleep is critical to consolidation. It can also occur under a nap or maybe during a cognitive break. So if you're not getting something, you just can't process it, get up, walk around, clear your head, take a shower, even check social media or work on something completely different and then come back. And you might be surprised how quickly you get it, that thing that you were struggling with. Sleep also serves to clear out our short-term memory, to make room for new information for the next day. This is why all-nighters aren't effective, right? You never take time to clear out that short-term memory between the cramming sessions. Similar things could happen at a professional conference. When we are flooded with information hour after hour after hour, and we might not be getting a lot of sleep. So all of this consolidation happens without any conscious effort on our part and involves many different parts of the brain. So you may have heard the old wives' tale that if you're trying to learn something, you put a book under your pillow and wake up knowing the information. Well, maybe that's sort of true. Our final step in the learning process is retrieval. This is really the true measure of whether you've actually learned something or not. Can you retrieve it when you need it so that you can use it to make sense of a problem or an opportunity that's in front of you. Now, the cool part in the process of retrieving information is that it actually makes that information stronger, makes that neural connection tighter and stronger because it stabilizes the synapses in that neural network. So each time a memory is accessed, it changes in a good way. New context, new associations, more diverse associations, better understanding, perhaps even wider application. It forces the brain to reconsolidate again. So it takes it out, it processes it again, and it puts it back. Sort of like filing and refiling a piece of paper or form in a patient's chart. Okay? That taking it out and putting it back helps to strengthen the learning process. So, what can learning science teach us? And more importantly, how can we use it to become better athletic trainers and better clinical practitioners? Well, the first thing that we can learn is we are poor judges of when we are learning well and when we are not. Because inevitably we are drawn to learning that is fruitful and efficient and not to learning that is hard, slow, and feels unproductive. Because we really don't want to put forth that effortful learning. Most of us have been doing it wrong our whole lives, right? Cognitive psychology, neuroscience, developmental educational psychology haven't really been around that long. Learning science is a fairly new field of research. And so since the 3rd grade, we've been practicing learning in ways that aren't supported by learning science, and we've gotten away with it. But we probably could have had a lot more fun and gotten a lot more sleep if we had learned some of these techniques that we'll talk about today. So let's say you're sitting in a CEU session and you're thinking, I already know this stuff. This is just a review. Don't they know I'm a certified athletic trainer? Why do they always put anatomy slides at the beginning of a presentation? How can I make this a learning experience? Well, you can. You can make it a learning experience by making it more effortful. Perhaps you do know all the muscles of the rotator cuff, inside and out. But can you quiz yourself by writing down the answers before the slide is advanced? The presenter says, these are the muscles of the rotator cuff. Can you jot those down? Okay. Can you jot down origins and insertions of each? Actions, innervations, common injuries. Do you know the surgical procedure that's associated with those common injuries? So making it more effortful, even if it's a review, makes it a learning experience. Learning science also teaches us that we are prone to illusions of mastery. That is, we tend to overestimate our mastery of knowledge or skills. In other words, we don't know what we don't know. What we do know, however, is that being accurate about what you know and don't know is critical in the decision-making process, because that's something we just don't want to mess up. I like this quote from Donald Rumsfeld. It comes from a 2002 press briefing about U.S. intelligence on Iraq's possible possession of weapons of mass destruction. Here's what he said. There are known knowns. There are things that we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we now know that we don't know. But there are also known unknowns. There are things we do not know, we do not know. So if you follow a lecture or a reading with ease, then you don't have to really think about it. It gives you this feeling that you already know the material and that you don't have to spend any time on it. You don't have to spend time reflecting, applying, or thinking about it. But if you were tested on that material, you may not be able to recall critical ideas or apply those ideas in a new context. The same thing happens when rereading and highlighting material as the primary study technique. And by the way, that's the #1 most commonly used study technique is rereading or rewriting your notes and highlighting. So why do we believe in this approach? Why is it #1? Well, guess what? It feels like it works. You see gains quickly, true, but research also supports that that learning is transitory, so it leaves very quickly. So it comes and it goes as quickly as it came. Because fluency or familiarity with material does not equal learning. Let me give you an example. On the screen, you see images of a penny. Now, I know you've all seen a penny thousands of times. You've held a penny in your hand. But can you pick out the correct image? If you want to, pause the video for just a second so you have time to really look at each of those images and see if you can pick out the right one. Did you get it right? Okay. If you didn't, don't be alarmed. You are in the majority. Here's another example. I am confident that most of you were probably involved in the development of the emergency action plan for your facility, or at minimum, you're aware of it. You have reviewed it, you've studied it, you've probably even rehearsed implementing it. So, can you tell me the location of the closest fire extinguisher to your office? How many times have you walked past that fire extinguisher? You may be very surprised to find that that's right outside your door, and you've walked past it hundreds of times and not even noticed it. So next time you go to your office, your challenge is to find the nearest fire extinguisher. And I'm confident that that fire extinguisher will trigger a memory trace of this talk. In fact, you may become aware of the location of fire extinguishers all over your building. So how can we know what we don't know? Well, the BOC is working on a new initiative called Continuing Professional Certification to provide professional learning and growth. The full rollout is still a few years away, but two of the components, those in yellow on the screen, are in the pilot phase in spring of 2020, and one has already been rolled out. The one in the blue has already been rolled out. That's the professional goals appraisal. Okay? It's worth 10 category B CEUs for the low BOC rate of $65. For all you non-math majors, that's $650 a CEU, which is below the market rate. So this appraisal allows clinicians to assess their own personal needs and then mindfully and intentionally select professional development activities to enhance the things they don't know. And our third piece of learning science is that knowledge is not sufficient, but necessary. Great quote from Albert Einstein. I'm a big Einstein fan because we share the same birthday. But old Al said, creativity is more important than knowledge. I don't know that it's more important, but it's definitely more fun. So when you approach a CEU conference, do you say, let's go get some knowledge today? Or could you say, let's go on a quest to find the solution to this challenge, which might be things we don't know? How can we do better at building knowledge and creativity? Because we need knowledge to be the foundation for higher level skills of analysis, synthesis, and creative problem solving. So here's another one of those play along at home activities. On the screen, you see 6 matches. Okay. What I would like for you to do is think about how you could make 4 triangles, 4 equilateral triangles from just using these 6 matches. Okay. You might need a few minutes to think about this, so feel free to pause the video for a moment to give yourself a chance to work. If you think you figured it out, feel free to email me your response and I'll be happy to tell you if you're right. I'm going to recommend that if you have not solved the problem in 5 minutes, then come on back And please resist the temptation to just go to Google and look up the answer. All right, so welcome back. I have a question for you. What is the process by which your brain takes a memory and replays it, rehearses it, fills in the blanks, and makes connections to already existing knowledge? If you knew it was consolidation, then you are correct. You know, sometimes when we get stuck in the middle of the problem-solving process, it helps to look at something different. I promise your brain is still working behind the scenes to make connections on that matchstick problem from a few minutes ago. So if you haven't figured it out, it's okay. We're taking a cognitive break. We're consolidating. We're giving our brain time to work. So take a moment to look at the question on the screen. Again, feel free to pause the video to allow some time to work. Once you've taken a few minutes to work, come back. Maybe you are already successful, or perhaps you would like a hint. So here you go. The solution can be found in the question. And I even highlighted it. For many of you, that is probably all it took for you to look at the problem in a different way, from a different angle, and come up with the solution. So while it's a little challenging to show here on the computer screen, it's much easier if I was drawing it on the board in real life. Adding the letter F to the line takes the F and makes it an E and completes the sequence. So mastery in any field requires gradual accrual of knowledge, conceptual understanding, judgment, and skill, which often comes through striving to find solutions, reflecting on those solutions, mentally rehearsing the solutions, and then eventually applying those solutions to solve the problems. It's for this reason that clinical education is so important to creating great athletic trainers. And the feedback and the deliberate practice that's focused on addressing your weaknesses, adjusting those, applying knowledge to real life situations, guided by teachers, mentors, preceptors, more experienced colleagues, promotes mastery and promotes professional enculturation. Mastery, however, does require a ready knowledge base. So no matter what Albert Einstein said, we do have to have that knowledge base, but a conceptual understanding of how to use it. The more unfamiliar or complex the set of knowledge or skills, the more study or practice that's necessary to master it and maintain it. So if we think about the number of competencies that are required to be taught in an athletic training education program, we think about the breadth and the scope of the BOC exam and the sheer volume of information that an athletic trainer must master to effectively function, one could argue that continued study is required to be able to master and maintain that. So what are the practical strategies that we might put into place as clinicians that will allow us to maximize the education part of our continuing education? We're going to explore 4 strategies and talk about how they might be applied to your current approach to continuing education. The first is distributed learning, also known as the spacing effect. The premise here is that multiple study or practice sessions over an extended time period promote learning better than one long concentrated session. The obvious example here being studying versus cramming. There's lots of studies that have looked at the optimal length of time between study sessions, whether that time frame was fixed or that was a gradually expanded time frame. They've also looked at the number of times information should be reviewed, and the results vary. Most are focused on preparing for a fixed point in time, like a test or your certification exam, versus learning for the sake of continuing education. But regardless, all of the studies support that maximal learning occurs when it occurs over an extended period of time. So think about some of the new skills that are now included as part of athletic training curriculum. They may not have been in place when many of us were going through our educational training. Things like advanced airways or other more advanced skills like IV placement, reduction of dislocations, Graston. Okay? How is that training typically presented? Okay? Usually, if you go to a Graston workshop or an IV workshop, it's a single intensive session or a workshop over a period of 36 to 48 hours. While that perhaps is better than sitting in a lecture hall with 500 of your best friends, due to its multimodal presentation, it's still massed, concentrated practice or cramming. The more time participants spend in a single session, the less effective that time becomes. Your brain just gets bored with excessive repetition. Short-term memory starts to get overloaded because there's no time for that consolidation to occur. So how can we apply distributed learning or apply that spacing effect? Because the majority of continuing education does not have built-in distributed learning in it. That doesn't mean, however, that you can't integrate it into your own learning process. So perhaps before you go to a conference, think about highlighting one or two talks that you're particularly interested in. See if there's a reference list. Choose one or two articles that you want to read or look up on your own. Before the session, then, you can formulate questions you have or information you want to learn so that you can prepare your brain to focus on that during the session. If there's a pretest, while not available for most events, the NATA Professional Development Center has a required post-test in order to earn credit for completion of those CEUs. So what if you print the test and complete it before you watch the session? This will help your brain begin to formulate what it needs to focus on and begin connecting it to previous experiences and your knowledge base. Stronger encoding. During the conference, take notes. Not write verbatim what the presenter is saying. Instead, write down key information, critical points, ways you might apply that information. And remember, if the material seems too easy, quiz yourself, apply the information to a variety of settings or situations. Instead of simply recalling it, apply it, synthesize it, analyze what the presenter is saying. Obviously, post-tests give you an opportunity to spend some time with the material and then check to see if you've learned it. Test the knowledge you gained in the session. Identify areas of weakness that you would like to explore further. Maybe you could also share what you've learned. Talk about it with others, debate it, reflect on how the information might be used in various situations, especially if you talk about it when you get home, because that gives you time for consolidation to occur. And can you start implementing the things that you are learning into your current practice? All right, our next strategy is retrieval practice, also known as the testing effect. So retrieval is one of the key components of learning. So it makes sense that practicing retrieval would enhance our ability to learn or maintain mastery of key pieces of information. Retrieval that forces the learner to search their memory and explain key concepts in their own words is even more impactful. Think short answer question instead of multiple choice. This focused mode of thinking during the initial learning session to understand information forces the learner to search their long-term memory to explain information, ideally using their own words. In one of the hallmark studies related to the testing effect, Roediger and Karpik demonstrated that multiple study sessions, reading over material, were not as effective as studying the information once, followed by repetitive retrieval or testing sessions for longer term maintenance of information. And that's what you see in the graph there on the left of your screen. Repetitive studying was, however, slightly more effective if the assessment occurred very quickly after the studying was complete, i.e. cramming, which is why most students do it, does work if you have to be ready for a test in an hour. Doesn't work if your test is next week. Similarly, in a randomized control study by Shaw, clinicians, in this case primarily physicians and nurse practitioners, who participated in an online supplement, which was multiple choice questions with feedback on correct or incorrect answers and explanations of the rationale for that response, following a continuing education conference, self-reported enhanced improvement in clinical practice compared to clinicians who only attended the conference prior to completing the assessment. And finally, Larson demonstrated that repetitive quizzing following attendance at an annual neurology conference nearly doubled long-term retention of knowledge compared to repetitive studying. It's important to note that retrieval practice also works in reverse. So pre-testing can prepare the brain for learning because, again, we are notoriously poor judges of our knowledge gaps. So how might we practice this retrieval? Let's think creatively about how this might be applied. As we discussed with distributed learning, pre and post tests are excellent learning tools for practicing retrieval. Similarly, writing down key takeaways after reading an article or attending a continuing education session makes you retrieve that information and write it down. Let's take that a step further. Maybe a couple days after you get home from the conference, or even a week or two later. Can you write down what you remember from the session? What were those key takeaways? What about some other creative ideas? Do you have an exam review guide floating around at your facility? If not, you might consider purchasing one and using it as a review tool for yourself personally. Most textbooks also have content review questions at the beginning or end of a chapter. And then perhaps you or your staff would like to have an article club where you select an article to read each month. Task one person with selecting the article and creating a quiz. And if it's a pre and post test, that's even better for participants to complete. Our third strategy is called interleaving. Interleaving might be a new concept to most of you. The concept of mixing related but distinct material during the learning process. It forces the learner to reconcile previously learned information, principles, concepts, procedures with more recent or upcoming information. This requires the brain to draw connections between new and previous learning and helps the learner think about when and how to use the knowledge and skill in varying and unexpected circumstances. Let's think about this in terms of learning a new skill, like hitting a baseball. If you only practiced hitting fastballs, you would probably get very good at hitting fastballs. But the minute the pitcher threw you a changeup or slider, you would fail to make contact. When you got into the game, you would be an easy out. But if during practice you saw a variety of pitches during batting practice that you didn't know were coming, you would learn to react to each pitch and ultimately end up becoming a better hitter. That's what interleaving is. To the learner, this feels slow and it feels very inefficient. So research shows that understanding and memory for information learned in this way is better than just massed practice. So even though it feels slower, the results show that it is a better learning tool. So how might we apply this interleaving concept? Well, if you've ever taught Introduction to Athletic Training Lab, you will know that the primary goal of every student in the class is that they want to be the best ankle taper in the whole wide world. So no matter what skill they are learning in lab, when they're given free time to practice any skill they need to work on, they will always practice taping ankles. But if you will force them, as the mean, nasty instructor, to practice something else, their ankle taping will improve because they're being exposed to different structures, different angles, different amounts of tension, different types of tape. Inherently, that improves all of their taping skills. So what are some of the ways we might use interleaving to enhance our learning as practitioners? Well, practicing skills. Do you remember how to do all those crazy skills from beginning athletic training lab? When's the last time you practiced some of those? What about role play? This can be extremely effective for situations that you don't come across very often, especially if you take the time to reflect, talk through your rationale for the actions you've taken. Think about rehearsal simulations, simulating emergency care situations. Every year, most staff practice their emergency care simulation. They practice running their emergency action plan. So as your staff is practicing that, what monkey wrenches could you throw in there to change it up a little bit? Maybe the keys to the back gate are lost. Okay? Maybe someone took the spine board to lab and it's not available. What are you going to do? So keeping everyone thinking and applying things in different ways is extremely important. And then I also like case studies to practice interleaving. Now, case studies are often incorporated into professional conferences, but they're typically short time slots and they are just presented. Instead, could the initial case be presented and the audience be given several minutes to write down their differential diagnosis, write down their next steps, perhaps even think, pair, share with someone beside them as they move through the various steps of presenting the case. This might be particularly helpful in cases where the differential points to multiple options and there are a few tiny little rules or hints that will lead to the correct solution. So that if you are faced with a similar patient presentation in an unfamiliar situation, you can still achieve a positive outcome. Now, just in case you'd forgotten our little matchstick problem, think back to this conundrum. If you approached it again, do you have any new or higher level insights? If you want, you can stop the video and practice again, or you can just keep moving. So just to see if you've been paying attention and to practice a little retrieval, give 2 examples of the spacing effect in action. How did you do? Did you come up with any of these ways to apply this? Okay. Did you remember what the spacing effect was? Our final strategy is elaboration. Elaboration is the process of creating multiple pathways of exposure to information. Learners are encouraged to vary how, where, when studying and practicing occur, so information is associated with a variety of different contextual clues that utilize various senses. Interacting with the material in a variety of different ways promotes solid encoding, requires reflection and connection to your knowledge base, and may take advantage of interleaving as well. The more engaged a learner is with the material, the more focused the mindset, and so the brain perceives the information to be important when it is consolidated. So how do we apply this? How can we take advantage of elaboration strategies? Well, varying your location and your mode of learning. When you're choosing different CEU experiences, don't just choose conferences. Choose some webinars, choose some workshops, choose some simulations or article reviews. Change up the places where you learn. Your brain makes different connections depending on where you were when you learned the material, or even what music was on when you're learning. The same reason you know exactly where you were when a key event happened. You know exactly where you were when the Challenger exploded, when the World Trade Center was attacked. Another option are mind maps. When you're sitting in a lecture, instead of just taking notes, can you create a mind map by pulling out the key ideas and drawing connections to other sub-ideas? If you can draw, and even if you can't, okay, doodling or drawing pictures of material you are trying to learn is a very effective tool. Your brain actually encodes images more firmly than it encodes information. And then there's the always favorite, song and dance. Create songs or dances to help you learn information. One of the favorite assignments from one of my labs was for students to create their own cranial nerve dance. Or perhaps you'd like to borrow Miley's bone dance.
Tibia, fibula, clavicle, rib. We call this the humerus, and that's no fib. And now I take it home with the parietal bone. It might be crazy, but I learned that way. Temporal and frontal too, and now I'm finally through. That makes 206. I found a way that clicks.
I'll spare you anymore, but it is on YouTube if you want to go watch the whole bone dance. So other things you might think about are mnemonics, right? Learning devices that you can use to help encode information in a different way, but also talking and reflecting on information. So I think athletic trainers are masters at this piece of elaboration. One of the key benefits I think of professional conferences is that you get to talk to other people who are doing the same job that you are in the same setting. And you get to talk about how they might manage a similar situation in a different way.
When I milk the cows.
So, in conclusion, I encourage you to take some time to reflect on the material we've discussed. Think about how you might apply it to your own continuing education process. I encourage you to pop back to the Padlet using the URL or scanning the QR code with your phone to discuss how we as a profession might need to reevaluate our approach to continuing education. And finally, just so you can practice spacing and retrieval, come back in a few days and add your 2 to 3 takeaways and read, reflect, and respond to the insights shared by others and take advantage of collaboration in that way. That's all. Oh, I almost forgot. If you want to know the solution to the matchstick puzzle, please email me and I'll be happy to share it with you. And of course, if you have questions, you are welcome to provide those or any feedback you have on this presentation. I've enjoyed being with you today, and I hope you have a great rest of your year.